Hi, I'm Ian.
I'm Patrick.
I'm Chris.
And we're the Fake Boys. Welcome to the first episode, guys.
It's been a long time coming. Really excited to be here with you all.
I'm so happy. This is so good.
Yeah.
So, Patrick, what's this podcast about?
So this podcast is about exploring what it means to create one's fate through the lens of personal sovereignty, self-knowledge, and self-empowerment. And we're going to be exploring these topics through our own personal experience and also at a really high level through philosophical discussions and larger life context too.
Since this is like our first episode, I think it'd be really great if we all gave I'd like to share, a little bit of like where I'm coming from. We all have kind of different perspectives. So that's where I think the richness of this podcast will come from, the variety of experience and tradition. So
you want to start us
yeah,
off?
for sure. So I've been studying with a Hermetic lineage for around just over 11 years now. So that's been really foundational to my understanding of the world and life. And, also have dabbled into the Vedic and the Eastern. So really learning how to understand and combine and find the unity between threads of philosophy, religion, spirituality, metaphysics, science. So I like to try to blend all those in a cohesive way through my understanding of the Kabbalah as well, as I've studied within that lineage. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Awesome. I am a visual artist and a martial artist, and I am deeply inspired by mythology, spirituality, philosophy, and I love using my passions as a way to explore deeper spiritual truths. And I would say right now I am passionate about using my art and martial arts as a way to embody a lot of the ideas that Chris just mentioned, and how can I be of the greatest service to the world through my arts that I choose to involve myself in this life. And this podcast is a really exciting opportunity, a new creative outlet for that. And I love that we get to explore this together. And yeah, excited to be here.
That's awesome. Yeah, I know that all of us individually have had this. Well, not necessarily, because I think you never thought you would do a podcast per se.
No, I was like, the world has too many podcasts, but our voice is important.
Right. And it's something that I have often thought about doing for a long time. And I didn't necessarily know what niche or what avenue I wanted to talk about it. I'm a multifaceted person. I'm a kickboxing, rapping, graphic designing personal chef. I wear a lot of hats, literally. And I knew that I wanted to do a podcast of some description, but I didn't know what it was going to be about. And this kind of spawned from an organic place of us just having these really deep, rich conversations on this exact couch, of just talking about life and different philosophical concepts of what does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be men in this day and age? Like, there's so many different rich topics to really explore, and we were finding that we were getting a lot of benefit from these conversations. And I think we also wanted to express that and have this as a public forum, so that way people could interact with this and hopefully get something beneficial from it.
I also want to shout out.
Oh yeah, no, I'll go. Yeah, for sure. And we're gonna get you in here as well.
I wanted to shout out the Divine Feminine here, Eden. This podcast did start out as us just organically talking on the couch, but her presence has always been here, and she always has that input that really kind of brings a balance to the force of us.
Absolutely.
Understanding ourselves
for
and
sure.
The greater picture at hand.
I think it's a perfect representation of kind of divine masculine and divine feminine as well. Sure, the podcast is called The Fate Boys, and we're the pulpit kind of figures that we're putting ourselves out there publicly, but this is also produced and creative directed by my lovely wife, Eden Shaw, who is hanging out in the corner. And I think it's I think it's a perfect representation of that, of her holding the container for what we're bringing in and helping us curate what it is that we're talking about in this as well. So my bio or my intro here, I'm Ian Shaw, and I have a background in martial arts as well. That's how I met Patrick. And I have a background in men's work, as well as I'm a UX UI designer, and so visual art as well, and visual design and music. I'm a musician. I'm a rapper, and I think what I really love about this podcast and what we're trying to bring here, what I'm passionate about talking about on this podcast, is these fireside chats, these kind of really deep, meaningful conversations that seem to happen in those moments when things calm down and we can bring our focus to one another. We put our phones away, so to speak, and really just connect and listen and be present with what wants to come up. And this particular podcast, episode 1, the first foray into this beautiful venture that we're going on, is about fate. We're going to be talking about fate and really what that means to us individually, and ask some questions that I don't know if we'll have an answer to, but really just explore what that really looks like and what it means to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great preface, because it's like, we're the fate boys. Why? What is fate? It's one of those things. It's very a broad definition. You're talking about backgrounds, and we were talking earlier before the show about like language. Me growing up in Spain, and language, and how even there's like, in Spanish the word is mostly the same as destiny. So it's like, that's already creating a little divergence there.
Lay it on, Chris. How do you say fate in Spanish?
Destino. And so there's a few maybe other ones, even like predestination is like one of the potential definitions, but the first one is destino. So it's like destiny, what is, and I think fate always does imply a sense of destiny, and, destiny could have its own huge broad definition, but there's that sense of something that's like outside of yourself, or something that like is pushing you into a direction. It's almost like, the bowl coming out of the pen or whatever, right? Like that, it's directing it to go a certain direction. And it's like, you still are free to move about, but really, there's really only so many ways you can go, because you're going to end up there. So, and then there's like, I think there's a lot of thought around, there's these, you were talking, I think, about threads of fate, but I also think of it as like branches, right? Like, maybe the fate is the end point, but how you get there is the journey. Beautiful. And that's where maybe like free will comes in, because there's always that concept of like how much free will is involved in fate, and is it like a subservience, or is it an empowerment? Like the concept of, a container is a safe space for you to grow into, and then you can maybe outgrow the container and you get a new one, like a kid in a playpen. So it's like, do we have fate as a container, but we can potentially like transcend it? Or
well, it's interesting because you're thinking about it from this perspective. I think of fate as the direction, but not necessarily the destination, or maybe the opposite, where it's like the destination is always going to be the same regardless of what avenue you take to get there. So it's
I teeter-totter.
But it depends on the situational. I think like different contexts would elicit a different definition of it, right? Yeah. Like depending on how you propose the definition or the structure of the container of how you're describing it. I think, well, even destination, like destiny, right? It's a similar kind of precursor in the languaging. And I think oftentimes fate and destiny are, in our understanding of as a unified term, they mean the same thing. They're synonymous, right? They're used interchangeably. Like that's your fate, that's your destiny. And it's an interesting thing to think about it from the perspective of it either being an internal question or this self-imposed or external imposition on you as a person. Like it's your fate. Like when someone says that's your fate, is that saying you are now beholden to this response? You don't have control of that outcome of that particular thing. And that's kind of been superimposed on you as this external thing. Or when you're saying your fate, you're taking it into your own hands to create your own reality, your own outcome, your own destiny, your own.
And this is where I think it's a matter of levels of perception and understanding that brings up in my, understanding and view of the world and experience is like, there's the spiritual and the physical. And so from the physical standpoint, like I think fate is more of like the how, but and then it flops to I think our ultimate destination is the same from a spiritual vantage point, like beyond life, like
Mm.
that we're going to this higher place and it's like a destination. But in physical life, it's like you're, because like I've experienced a lot of deja vu, so it's like, is that fate? Is that like I'm supposed to? Is that the only way I getting some? Like maybe it's not so much how I'm getting there, but it's like a certain check mark that I actually have to experience or hit.
Mm-hmm.
So it's less about the destination in that, but there is a maybe an ultimate sense of destination that for me is transcendent in like maybe a more spiritual uh, frequency or dimension as opposed to just like pure physical life. Like,
Yeah.
One of the things that I really like that I see you both circumambulating is the idea of predestination versus choice and sovereignty. And I'm curious about what each of you think in terms of, predetermination, predestination, or like you were hinting at, how much agency do we have on the path of fate, and how much can you branch off in your own exciting, personally chosen directions? Chris, you want to hit us first?
sure. So, from my understanding and from where I'm coming from, and like the lineage I study, it's like know thyself. So, what is like knowing yourself at all levels? So, it's like you're gaining agency, sovereignty, and you're starting to exercise will. So, I think will is kind of like a muscle. It's like we all have it, but it's like can be really weak or can be really strong. And I think will does allow us to kind of become the captains of our own ship. But like, I think from a starting point, we're kind of just will is very limited.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's like, uh, I think we all experience, a sense of like programming and like this like matrix reality. Maybe people use that word.
You're born in a specific
context. And it's like, it feels like you don't have much choice and all this stuff. And then it's like, you're talking about sovereignty. What does sovereignty mean? And how do you harness it? And that's like a huge question in itself. But like, okay, you start going within and then that, because it's like, otherwise the sails and the wind is gonna, but like you can start steering the ship. So I think that's where willpower is, but like the ocean is still the ocean and like nature's still the nature and like, and the landmass is where the landmass is, but like you can steer it and you can have choice, but there is still some sort of container that my understanding and feeling and sense is like there is like a deeper consciousness, if you want to call it God or whatever, that is underlying and kind of flowing directly. Like in Taoism, they call it the way, right? It's like you're flowing with the river. And so it's like you can navigate, but like you want to go with, not against.
Well, even you can go against, depending on how difficult you want your journey to be, right? You look at these archetypes or these stories like Odysseus, for example, right? And he sets off on this voyage and he goes through this literal epic tale. And how much of that was predetermined, how much of that was, I mean, it's obviously a story, right? Loosely based on events, but the idea that you have this full totality of your life, let's say like an individual's life, let's say it's about 100 years, right? And you have, like you're saying, these check marks or these boxes of moments that occur down the line. The question, I guess, that I'm curious about is how much of that from conception, like when you're coming into being in this world, when you're born, the second that you're born and you're here, how much of that is already set in the stone? That you're going to have 3 kids, you're going to name them Jamal, or like how much of that is going to be already predetermined versus the choices and decisions that you make? Maybe the framework is there. Like we have societal pressures of how we anticipate people to procreate and to move forward. Like you're probably going to find a partner, you're probably going to have kids, you're probably going to have a job, you're probably going to do these things. And then you're starting to get into this question of like nature versus nurture. How much of that did you come in with intrinsically?
Yeah.
And the one thing that I love to talk about too when people question whether or not being gay is a choice, is there wouldn't be gay people in Alabama, like, or in Mississippi if it was a choice. It's so much easier to not when you're faced with a lot of that oppression. You don't have, when you're talking about your reality that's true for you and like what is real and what is coming from that really like deep sense of your true identity that's outside of those types of conditionings. Like what part does fate play in that? Because I think like a lot of those types of core identities, like as an artist, I'll also speak from that perspective. I don't wish that on anybody. And what I mean by that is by being an artist, there are moments where I have to express myself or I'm going to implode. And I found music as an art form, or writing and rapping and poetry as an art form, to express myself in a way. And I feel like I came in with that. I feel like I came in with this kind of like fingerprint identity marker of like, I'm an artist. And if I don't express myself fully in that way, or not necessarily fully, but I don't have some form of outlet in that capacity, I'm going to go insane. And I think that and why I say I don't wish that on other people, is that the amount that I feel and the amount that I feel like I'm compelled to in some instances, where I have to at 3 a.m. wake up and write lyrics or like write something down, that's such an arduous thing to have to wear, to like walk with that mantle of I have this identity of having this pseudo cross to bear of like I have to, like I don't really have a choice. And so that kind of ties into me, this idea of like fate and predeterminism, is like I feel like I came in with that. I don't feel like I was taught to be a musician or to be an artist. Like I feel like I had that in me. And how I chose to express that, whether it was through painting or music or whatever, taking like photography, like all of that is up for debate.
Right? Well, yeah, I think you bring up a lot of good points, and there's a lot of like things that arise from that. Like you're talking about coming in, right? So it's like, okay, well, that's, there's concepts around like, well, we somehow in some experience choose things before we even are alive, but to that, whether you believe it or not, right? Like the container is there. And so I think that's where it's a good conversation around potential. We all come in with potentiality, and there does seem to be some sort of like blueprint or individual expression. But you're also talking about like, people wouldn't choose to be gay in Alabama or something. But I was like, there is also a sense sometimes of people, and this is where like the know thyself, developing the muscle of will, is like, it can get really confusing as like, what's my blueprint and what's my programming? And also like, I know for myself and where I am today is like embracing the struggle, not in a, I have to suffer a struggle or whatever, but like that, you want to be free, like of attachment to suffering, but, actually embracing like, Jim best metaphor, I think simplest metaphor is like muscles, and like,
love it.
you want resistance, like, and this is like from a Hermetic standpoint, like progression, and like there is, there's no life without like resistance, which really allows to bloom. Otherwise, it's like if the little, I don't know, but like didn't, there's a seed, it has to break the seed. But if it's just like, oh no, there's a hard wall in front of me, I'm just not gonna grow, and so it's like a really fine line of discernment, and this is where like the self-knowledge and actually building the muscle of will to be like, hey, what is fate and what is the potential, and am I embracing it or not? I earlier shared about a Seneca quote of like, are we, he alludes to things around like being dragged by fate or going willingly, and it's like, is freedom aligning with this path and course that's set, or is true freedom being like, fuck it, I'm completely sovereign and whatever I say goes?
That's sort of like the Neo approach in the Matrix when he first meets Morpheus, and Morpheus says, how do you feel about fate? And Neo, I think, embodies the idea that a lot of us maybe started out with at some point, where it's like, I don't like the idea that I'm not in control of my life. And yet something that I love that you brought up is the image of the seed, and that the blueprint is in there. And even though the seed has to exert its, or the plant inside of the seed casing has to exert its will in some sense to grow and break through the resistance. But even though it might not be aware of it consciously as we understand it, the oak tree is in that seed from the very beginning. And something I want to touch on there is something that has really inspired my idea of fate, and something that really lands well for me in terms of choice and predestination. Carl Jung coined the term individuation. And I love that because you have internal pressure coming from within of what do I want? What do I need? Who am I? Where am I going? All the good stuff, right? And then at the same time, you have external pressure from nature and the outside world and culture and society that are exerting the opposite direction of pressure on you. And in between the internal and the external pressure, you, the individual, are blossoming and becoming the tree that perhaps you were always born to be, but you're deciding along the way, like, how do I want to angle toward the sun? How do I want to branch out? When do I want to drop my fruit? You know?
And something that came up, and I'm loving this analogy for me when I was thinking about it, to come to another movie quote, is I think it was Kung Fu Panda 1 with Master Uwe, where he's talking about like the peach tree, where he's like devouring all these peaches or whatever. And he was talking about being present in that moment. But when he was talking to Master Shifu about will, and he was just like, I decide where to plant it, how to plant it, the time of year to plant it. There's so much that I control about that. He's just like, yeah, but no matter what you do, that tree is going to be a peach tree. You could wish for, an oak, you could wish for a walnut, but it's going to be a peach tree. However you cut it. It doesn't matter where you plant it, how you plant it, any of that. It was destined to be a peach tree. And so I think that there's an interesting caveat in there around a real truism about something that's intrinsically true, regardless of where you were born, how you were brought in, where you were brought up, what school you went to.
Just the soil.
There's something like intrinsic to the nature of that, and maybe that's fate. Maybe that is that kind of predestination.
Well, I like you use the tree analogy because in Kabbalah, they have those concepts around like personality, individuality, the different levels on the tree, and so it's kind of like, a lot of that there's that outside pressure, and it's like pressure can be good, but a lot of the outside stuff is like, they're like trying to put stickers on you.
It can be like societal programming.
Yeah, sure. and even though you were saying it's almost like a suffering of the need to express, but really that's maybe the blueprint in individuality that's trying to come through, and the pain comes from the external pressure not aligning with the internal
There's dissonance
blueprint. Yeah,
and
so you're talking about how you align with the sun, and it's like, you can waver, but then you ultimately are wanting to stay in that center so you can continue to grow towards, in this case, the sun as a metaphor.
And I think each of us do, just my personal opinion, that there is a self with a capital S operating through each of us as individuals, and that self exerts a gravitational pull on our individuality. So, Ian, I love the art of you came in, and yes, you did make choices along the way of like, oh, I'm really drawn towards hip hop, I really like graphic design and these different directions. But on some level, I think the archetype of creative expression was already there in you, exerting itself from within, and you got to choose how you wanted to express that in your outlets.
Right. Yeah, I think that aligns for me how I think about my own life and my own experience of where I'm 38. I think I'm the oldest one on the podcast.
Yes, you are.
Okay. So I have more life experience than all of you, so I can just talk from my experience.
But I have more wisdom, so.
But I've got more muscle, than all of you. So.
Let me go bench real quick.
Let me go hit some reps. Knock some reps out. So, but it's interesting because I don't necessarily think that age is synonymous with wisdom. But I do think that there is something that you learn through time of having an experience, being able to see. I've seen enough seasons, I've seen enough turns of the wheel, so to speak, in my own
Keyword
experience.
experience, I would say.
Right. Which I actually have tattooed on my forearm in Gaelic as my definition of the meaning of life. It's tahi. And when I've thought about that in my youth of trying to like, what does it all mean, Basil, kind of mentality of trying to understand my own personal definition of what the meaning of life is. And what I keep coming back to and what I've literally tattooed on my body is that we're here to experience it. We're here to experience it. Good, the bad, the ugly,
Sounds
the beautiful.
so simple.
But it's like trying to like, because it's this massive thing, right? The meaning of life. You could take it in so many different directions. And in my own soul searching, that's kind of how I've boiled it down. It's to experience it. It's to be here and to go through it. And I think a lot of how we go through it is up for debate, is up for our own determination. And there's an aspect of will. I think that's part of it. And I also think that there's a part of it where you do have a choice, because a peach tree is going to be a peach tree. But how that tree chooses to like blossom and show its foliage and be in the world, that's still a choice. And I think that we have a choice intrinsically about how we can choose to show up to different situations. We can show up in anger, we can show up in frustration, or we can show up in joy. We can show up messy, we can show up polished. And we have that at our disposal kind of at any given time. And at a certain point, that's somewhat like a superpower to really like look at a situation that's on the outside just horrible. And just like you walked in, like I'll use an analogy or an example from my life. I used to own a screen printing and embroidery company in upstate Washington, upstate Oregon, lower Washington.
North of here.
Northwest, Pacific Northwest. And we were dealing with a crazy push of an order. We had an order that was due the next day. It was like several hundred, like 800 plus items that all were like all individually pressed with numbers and names. And it was like for this basketball league, it was massive, huge for us because we were a small company. And so we were trying to pull off this miracle for this basketball league. And our washout sink area flooded. So it was just like pumping water all into the warehouse. And then we got a call from my dad's caregiver, and he had just had a seizure and flipped his 300 plus pound body out of his bed. And so he's laying on the floor, and she was in her 60s. She couldn't lift him up. Yeah. So it's just me and my brother. We're the only two like who own and ran this business. So we have this deadline pressing down our necks that this is due tomorrow. A pipe burst, and now we have a flood in our workshop. And our father is laying on the ground, incapacitated and needing assistance. And if we called the ambulance to go there, that would be extremely expensive, and it's not actually what he needs. He doesn't need to go to the ER. It would just be he just needs help getting back into bed, basically, and to come back from having the seizure. And my brother and I were just like looking at each other, and we just started laughing because it's insane. Like it's just insane. There's just like it was too much. Like any one of those is enough of a pressure to make you want to crack and crawl in like the fetal position, which I've done before.
And then you ask yourself, is any of that fate?
Exactly. Did you feel like the way those experiences all converged in that moment on you and your brother, that it seemed orchestrated?
I mean, at a certain point when you look at those types of events where things, and there's another whole story about how my wife and I met that seems very fate related, but that instance when we were in our screen printing business, it was just like it was like a perfect storm of stuff that just all popped off at the same time. And the point that I'm trying to draw from that is, in that moment, I could have thrown a hissy fit, flipped a table over, screamed into the sky like, Khan from, and just called it. I could have done that. But instead, it was just so over the top that we were like laughing about it. We're like, this is insane. This is insane that this is happening like this. And so the way that it got resolved, because I'm sure people want resolution, is I went to go help my dad's caregiver with my dad, and my brother tended to the flood to turn off the water line to get that secured. We took a bunch of old misprints, like hoodies and shirts and stuff, and threw them on the ground as like a barrier to like soak up the water. And then I drove over there, and then I got my dad situated, and then came back, and then we just pulled an all-nighter. We just worked until 8, 9 in the morning, and then my brother loaded up the car with all the jerseys and everything to go deliver them, and I slept on the floor in our entryway. We closed the blinds, locked the front door even though we were technically open, and we're like, not today, Lord, and like locked that and just like face down on the carpet. I'm just gonna post up here for a minute, and just like napped for like 2 hours while he went on the delivery.
As you're talking the stories, I'm thinking about like the fate, and it's we're talking a lot about navigation, destination, and like almost like this higher thing that's guiding, and yet also thinking in many ways every circumstances was created by someone's will, or you could say even lack of will, like, but they're acting, right? Like your dad fell out for whatever reason, but like you're in that situation, you chose to own a company, you said these circumstances, but then there's also this interesting, like you're saying the higher self, and my understanding meaning of life, I really like you're saying like experience, and like my first kind of dabble into meaning of life stuff was realization was beingness. And so it's like your higher beingness was also using the pressure and circumstances that in a sense you also created but not fully responsible for, like you're not responsible for your dad or whatever, but to then choice point, like, do I navigate to the higher like opportunity, like you've expressed to me that you enjoy your life now more than in that circumstance, and so it's like, but would you have never done that if you hadn't accepted that choice point? And you talk about the peach tree, and I really like that because it's like you have to accept the peach tree, and it is going to be a peach tree, but you also, in accepting things, you have the opportunity for a choice point. But if you don't, then it's just like that, it's going to hit you in the head over and over, like, because, and you're saying, oh, it's always going to be a peach tree. But if you accept that it's a peach tree, it's a peach tree, and you have a lemon tree, maybe you hybridize them and you create something new, which is like even crazier than like to create something new out of something, but you have to like know it and accept it first.
Yeah. Back to Chris's quote from Seneca, do you want to accept and embrace your fate or get dragged kicking and screaming to the finish line? On the notion of individuation, there's been a lot of research in that everyone does have their own unique individual direction that they're blueprinted with, their own type of fruit tree. And something I would love to hear from you both, if you've ever experienced this, I'm sure you have, I certainly have, where if you're unconsciously resisting your individuation path, your fate, neuroses develop because you're going against your Tao, you're going against your blueprint, and life's way of teaching you through this gravitational force that we're trying to talk about is you start to develop neuroses, anxiety, overthinking. You start bumping into things in your reality that are like shadow versions of where you're supposed to be. Stephen Pressfield has a great idea about this. Stephen Pressfield, one of the most inspiring books, highly recommend, is called The War of Art. And he talks about, for creatives, for artists, writers, musicians, etc., anybody can apply this. If you have a dream of expressing your creativity in your own unique way and you keep resisting it out of fear or unconsciousness or what have you, you will find yourself in shadow careers, shadow opportunities that are piss poor reflections of where you're actually supposed to be. For instance, some writers will, instead of writing that book, that novel, that screenplay, if they keep turning away from their authentic path, they'll find themselves in a job that really crushes their soul. Like, for instance, copywriting instead of writing the novel. Nothing against copywriters, but you can see how it's a shadow reflection of writing that novel or screenplay.
Mm.
You know?
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, I don't know if I mentioned earlier to the audience that, I'm also a musician. I play guitar. And so, like, I have that same kind of creative drive and feeling that Ian expresses, and, you're also an artist, with more visual. And, like, I feel like I suffer when I don't. And, I had like, I'm talking about it through music, but I also had a conceptual realization around this concept of, like, is true freedom aligning with the will of God, a higher will, a higher something? Because, when you're younger, you're like rebellious and you're like, that's real freedom. And then you're like, but that could lead to anarchy, chaos, and suffering that actually never really amounts to like a strong foundation for something beautiful to flourish for long periods of time. So it's like, okay. And it's really interesting that now in my experience, doing the things that, like, whatever your blueprint is, I mean, it's a process of discovery, and it's almost like a life process, but there is sometimes, like, as simple as knowing that. And I love the analogy of music because, Hendrix, me being a guitarist like Hendrix, everybody recognizes Hendrix. You don't have to see Hendrix playing and know it's Hendrix. And it's like, there's a lot of combination of notes out there, but there's only certain combination of notes. And yeah, you could talk about timbre and distortion pedals and all that, but, like, at the end of the day, he and I could play the same riff, say the same bar, whatever it is, and it's just different. And it's like, what is that? And that's, like, transcendental, and I think that's part of the magic of music in this case. But everybody has, I think, that.
Well, I think it's finding your voice,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think it's finding your sound. I think it's finding your individuation about how you're expressing that thing. Like, you're talking about playing the guitar, right? There's a certain number of notes, there's a certain number of chords, different ways of playing it, but finding your way of bending and putting that in someone's hands. You listen to Prince play,
Dude.
you know what I mean? Like, you put
body chills.
First time I saw him play, I was like, is this Prince? I thought he's just like this. Whatever.
But you put a guitar in his hands, and that's different than if you put a guitar in B.B. King's hands.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean? But same thing. You watch B.B. King play, and it's like, holy shit. But it's a sound, and it's like you're saying, it's recognizable. It's they're expressing their fingerprint, their unique way of doing that art. And for me, being into hip hop and being into rap, you listen to, like, Snoop Dogg, he comes on immediately that's Snoop.
Mm-hmm.
There's no one that sounds like Snoop. No one, right? And there's certain artists that just have that sound. They found their sound and they're expressing it. And by doing so, they are doing something unique and organic and that only they could do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's like there's a lot of copycats. There's a lot of people who sound like other people. Oftentimes people will refer to their art like someone else, like, oh, it's a combination.
Imitation is the greatest form of flattery, right?
Or it's like when you're trying to, like, in the process of you trying to discover your own individual voice.
You need role models.
Oftentimes you will have been impressed by people and inspired by others. And simultaneously, how do you recognize the influence while simultaneously being true and authentic to your form of expression?
That's where I think, and mentioned maybe the word synthesis earlier, is like that. I think honoring synthesis is probably, to me, the most, like, magical thing, because I've been a snob head musician where it's like, right, it's like, oh dude, don't bite my flow or whatever, or like, this band sounds like that band, they're posers or whatever, right. But it's like,
they're Kirkland brand Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Yeah, we all have our training wheels, but like, I'll make music and I am always thinking like, oh, it's influenced by this, or it looks like that, or it sounds like this. But and then eventually I'm like, but my unique combination of influences that I've taken and digested, there's also like that, and this is what I love about music and art and expression, is like the transcendent, right? We're talking about fate. And there's always this, their destiny even, and it's like there's always this call to something beyond. Like, could fate truly exist in a purely, I want to say, materialistic framework?
Interesting.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm thinking about the self with a capital S. I wouldn't say that I'll use I statements here. I didn't necessarily come into my life with like, I'm going to be this kind of artist. I signed that contract before I was born in this human body. I think that the self has a panacea of possibilities and potentialities that are part of the blueprint,
But
right?
what if it's not a choice? What if it's just you just know because you just are?
Totally.
That's the question about fate.
Yeah.
Like, did you choose it? You know, I mean, I think that's the big question about destiny or any of those things. Because if you truly believe in destiny and fate as a predeterminate factor, you can't make a wrong choice. People get so like hunkered into the mire of trying to make the right choice.
What's my
Oftentimes-
purpose?
Right. Well, the alignment with purpose, right? The idea if I'm not living my true purpose, I'm fucking up somehow.
I really like the series. I was watching Vikings. I didn't finish
So
it,
good.
but like that for them, the way they presented fate was different than this like destiny, predestination, almost like an enslaved. They were feeling free in the alignment with fate, but also comfortable with the unknowingness. So, for example, they're going to raid. And he's like, I love to go fight, and if I die, I die, and if I don't, I don't, because it's fate. So there's like they have trust in this case the gods, but like they have trust in something taking care of them or guiding them. So there really is no, like you said, no wrong way.
There's a freedom in that choice. There's a freedom in that surrender. I would say, like when you surrender to being a peach tree, and you know you're never going to be that willow that you always thought you wanted to be, and you accept the fact that you are a peach tree. There's a lot of freedom that comes in that self-identification of recognizing. Because I think to your point when you were making that thing earlier about the struggle that people feel when they've gone against the grain of what their predestiny was. Like, you're supposed to be a peach tree. Why are you dressing up like a willow? You're not a willow, bro. Like, you're a peach tree. Just be a peach tree. Like, what's the problem with that? And the suffering and the pain that people experience when they're going against their true, authentic version of who they are. And it's not to say that anyone can't also change aspects of themselves, but I think there is an intrinsic internal knowing, and this is what I think we're talking about at the beginning, of like to know thyself, really the act of like flexing it like a muscle. If you're not doing an internal landscape navigation check periodically, you are more at fate's whim to get knocked through the branches and let the wind blow you in your identity completely into another direction because you're anticipating something outside of yourself. But if you have that staunch, fervent realized aspect of yourself, to know I am a peach tree. He's a peach tree as the analogy. But if you have that like harnessed, and you are coming back to like really look into that internal landscape and really become in harmony with those more true, intrinsically true things, because I feel like there's a lot of subjective truths.
Yeah. Well, this is what I was just gonna say.
We all sit up. We're like, "Whoa, let's go."
This is where I think the beauty of Hermetics. So the Hermetic axiom of like as above so below, as below so above, as within so without, as without so within. And so know thyself with the capital S is that when you can really take ownership, because even when we're talking about fate, it does seem like you're gonna get there somehow, but how did you get there? Suffering and crying, or not, right? And so it's like,
what's the surrender piece of it?
Yeah.
Because if you just accept it, like this is where you're going. And I also feel like there's a difference between acceptance, surrender, and giving up.
Yeah.
Because I think that the giving up is you've just been beaten down.
Yeah. But I think there's also speed.
And there's not an acceptance part of it though.
Yeah.
You haven't owned it.
You haven't made it as and when it's interesting because we're talking about it from this perspective of, did you choose it or didn't you?
Right.
Did fate happen to you or did you choose your own fate? And if you chose your own fate, was it actually pre-laid for you or did you choose it?
Well, I think it goes,
real quick before we get too far, I love the example of Vikings because they did have that surrender of like, oh, we're doing this raid, whatever Odin wills. And yet the agency of the Viking was, and the Spartans and the samurai, is that I will show up in my fullness as a warrior and claim the heroic path so that I can die with honor or I can serve with honor. That was where their will was. And then if I lost the thread on the resistance, we'll come back to that. But I love the example of the Vikings, the agency there.
Well, the resistance, I think, is interesting. I was talking about the greater self, but we were talking about accepting reality and then kind of other people's, like, that there's like these senses of truth. And it's like, well, this is what's interesting, the external versus internal, that is necessary. But I like to, in my experience and understanding of spiritual growth, is like looking at the external mostly as a reflection of the internal, so that I have the opportunity to kind of grab bait by the balls. It's interesting because it's like how we get there, but I think when is important, and that like the willpower is, we are working with fate, and that you were talking about acceptance, and I think it's only by accepting our fate or our blueprint that we're actually able to actualize it, because it might be actualized regardless, but it's like there's something that just feels like big around taking ownership of it, actualizing it, and then actually once you've potentially either actualized it or embraced it and accepted it, then you might actually have the ability to change it.
That's amazing. I got it.
Okay.
So I think all of us have gone through a stage of when you are resisting your fate, especially when you're young.
Oh yeah.
You buck against the reins. And
That's
I think
natural.
and it is natural because I think it's important. Like you have to buck against the reins of destino so that you can claim it for real by choice, and you can come home to your path by choice. Like, oh yeah, I actually, I tried being a willow, I tried being a doctor, I tried being a lawyer because that's what I thought was the right thing to do. I'm actually recognizing that my path is this, and it feels like home, and it's funny because it was there the whole time.
You have that in the hero's journey, in part of that arc, which we'll probably have to do our own episode
for sure.
solely just on that.
Whole podcast.
Whole podcast is about that. But just having that as part of that journey is, and it's an important part of it, is that you have to diverge from the path. You have to go away from it.
Contrast.
You have to. Well, the only way to really,
son.
well, from our background, using martial arts as an example, the only way that I can know that I'm off balance, or when I'm on balance, when I have the right line, is to know when I don't have the right line.
Or when you stop training for a minute.
For sure. Yeah. Like you recognize that you're so far off the course. And when you're in the flow and you're training and you're regular with it and you're recognizing it, and then if you toss yourself off of that, or you pull yourself off of that, or you put yourself in a position where
you let yourself drift.
Right. Well, you see that with the ranging aspect of martial arts can pretty much be summed up with range and timing. Right?
Pattern
recognition. But the idea is like, are you ahead on time, behind on time, or on time? Are you on the right angle? Did you angle first? That's the timing aspect of it. But if you're ahead on timing, if you're ahead of the other person who you're fighting with, you are on a superior angle for the attack.
You control the situation.
You will win in that moment. So it can all boil down, regardless of the practice, whether it's jiu-jitsu or judo or Wing Chun or Kali or like whatever you practice, it all breaks down to that. Are you on the superior timing and the superior positioning?
I think you open up a whole can of worms around that, because it's like, the old word judgment, modern probably word discernment, that comes through contrast. And we were talking, I think last time we were hanging out, from like that scientific perspective of clocks and measurement and distance, and does time actually exist?
Yeah.
And
that's another one.
Which is a whole thing,
Yeah.
And then of course, like, I talk a lot about the spiritual, but I love also the galactic and the kind of the interstellar aspect of things. And like, is it possible to travel to other planets? How? And, and then, we recently saw Dune, and I'm not going to spoil anything, but we might have an episode on that. And, I feel like the stories about in this case, the actor Jim Chalamet, Shay, choosing or resisting fate, and then also kind of choosing his own fate, and even the other characters around that, and it's like
there's so much mythology and story around, just like you said, what happens when you resist the call of destiny, and what happens when you click back into place, and that more full expression of self that is allowed to come through once you claim it.
Exactly. And I think that that's the aspect that I really wanted to like nail, and I think you said it perfectly there. Of it's when you go away from it because you didn't choose it.
Mm-hmm.
You see this with Siddhartha and becoming the Buddha. It's like he was born as Brahmin into a really wealthy religious family, and he chose to go live the ascetic life and walked away from it. Then like I know this isn't mine, but people would die to be in his position that he was born into. They would be like, "Yo, we're living in object poverty out here, and you're casting that away. What the hell? You're just like throwing away your privilege." But he knew that he needed to walk away from that to become the symbol that he is for all of humanity. And the idea from that is to go so far away from what you were presented with. Even if you end back up with what you were presented with, you are now choosing it as opposed to it being just cast upon you as something that you were supposed to do.
It's interesting because in the story of Buddha, like he's born into this, and he chooses to remove himself, and yet in removing himself is kind of like unattachment, right? Like going with the flow in the simplest way to put it, and like being provided, just having a bigger bowl and being provided for, like, God, the universe, people around you will take care of you.
But that's fate, right? We're talking about that as in trusting in that. Trusting that I'm doing the actions that are in alignment with what I see as my true path, my true destiny, if we want to, then I will be provided for. You might not be provided for in the way that you think you want.
Right.
People think, oh yeah, just the law of attraction. I'm going to be a millionaire by doing this, that, and the other thing. And like maybe you'll be provided for in completely other ways with really good relationships and friends and opportunities that you may not have experienced otherwise. And it's hard, I think, for people to grok that kind of shift in perspective. Is they think, I don't have anything. I'm not given. Where are you, universe? Why aren't you providing for me? I trusted in you, and now I'm on the edge of this moon, and I don't know where I'm going. And I think if you take a beat and do that internal landscape navigation check-in thing, you really can recognize what you do have. I think part of this too, coming back to what I was saying around like the willingness and choice that you have around how you react to it, you're kicking and screaming or you're going willingly, is this idea that you have the ability to either come from a place of gratitude.
Key right there.
Right. And you either coming from a place of gratitude for it, or you're coming from a place of woe is me, what happened in my life, #victim.
Well, one of my teachers says, if you don't have gratitude, you'll never have enough. And that kind of goes back to that redefining abundance, especially in I myself have struggled with it around like money. And it's like, is it only money? But like the other definition of abundance that I got from one of my teachers was like, it's having what you need when you need it. And I was like, oh, so I do have friends. I do have love. I do have food. I do have a lot of things.
Check.
Maybe I could use more money, or maybe I could whatever. But really, even in the most dire of situations, I've had abundance. And I'm like, sometimes it is just that little bit of true gratitude. And then, I don't always feel full true gratitude, but it really does. It's crazy. Like I had experiences growing up where I'm like grateful for something almost like in advance. And then it happens like something simple, like, oh, I'm grateful for my friends. And then my friend calls me, and, it's like just little things like that are instant confirmations of like, oh, I do have enough. And I am, and it is that feeling of aligning with something. Maybe I'm not thinking of fate in the moment, but I'm like, this is leading to something bigger.
Right. But if you don't have a place inside your psyche for where gratitude can exist and blossom, you won't even see it. You won't even appreciate the fact that your friend called you when you were thinking about them. And I've definitely struggled big time over the years of having a very specific vision of what I want to come in. And even though that vision might be truly authentic, and I've thought it through and I've really like done the work of trying to align it with my heart's desire, if I'm not careful, I will let the specificity of that vision blind me from what is blossoming in my life and what is contributing to my well-being. And if I don't let go a little bit of what I think my fate is supposed to be,
well, that's like
trouble.
I'd say like higher will, lower will, or
Totally.
big S, lower S. And I saw this Instagram meme like yesterday or something that was like, when you realize that abundance is ever flowing, but you only create blocks to it. And I was like,
get out of my head.
But I think, gratitude, abundance, all that is amazing topic, and maybe even we could do a whole episode on it. However, I'd be really intrigued because we've been talking about this, and I think it's up for interpretation. Of course, as we've all discussed fate, and we've kind of achieved maybe a little bit more synchronicity on everything. But what does Google have to say?
What does Google have to say?
Or Oxford Dictionary.
So, Webster's, because we're a Webster's house. It says...
We're Webster's house? We're OED in this house. Oxford English.
If you want abundant dictionary, then you
do not go to Webster's.com.
It's like
Dictionary.com.
Oh, no, this one does say Oxford. Apologies.
It was like Lewis or Tolkien that they were trying to tell him how to spell dwarves, and he's like, I helped write the dictionary. Like, don't tell me how to do it.
Amazing. So according to Google and Oxford Dictionary, the definition of fate is the development of events beyond a person's control, regarded as determined by a supernatural power. That is literally the definition. I also included fate versus destiny in the definition, which I thought was really interesting. It kind of adds a little twist, which is fate implies a lack of control or inevitability, while destiny suggests a sense of purpose or direction that can be influenced by personal agency. And I liked that definition. I thought it took a really interesting swing from what we've been talking about.
I think a good merging of those feels that they're actually connected, that maybe it starts out as fate, and once you exert agency and willpower, it becomes destiny.
Wow.
Yeah.
That resonates as true.
It feels true.
It feels really like it anchors the fate conversation.
I love this.
In a really cool way. Yeah.
Patrick, where the fuck did you go?
Went to the bathroom.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Wow, I think that's a good summary of fate for our first episode here. Dude, recap?
Yeah, gotta do it.
So she just defined, Webster defined.
No,
Oxford English OED.
And I'm loving it. I love that, how that circles back on destiny.
Totally.
It's wonderful.
Did you hear my
No?
It just came through. Because as she was reading Destiny and Fate, it seems like the connection point is one's like predetermined and then the other one's more like you're stepping into it. And I was like, it rang true when I said it out loud. And I hadn't thought about it. Was like, it starts as fate, and then when you when you use your agency and build your will, it becomes destiny.
I love that. That makes me think of the idea of the personal myth, and both Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell were huge on this, in that when you first come into your life, it's totally unconscious, but you're drawn towards certain archetypes, certain books, certain stories, certain themes, certain arts. And then only once you take a retrospect, you're like, oh, it all added up. Of course I got into hip hop.
Right.
Of course I got into screen printing. Of course I got into punk rock, heavy metal.
Dude, I didn't even think I was into music. Like, my mom made me take all of us, my siblings and everything.
She made you?
Yeah,
You didn't want it at all?
In third grade, she's like, you're going to start
You're gonna learn an instrument.
Piano.
Yeah.
So I took piano. I'm going to quit piano as soon as I can. Then, like, teenager depression, all that. And all of a sudden, like, around ninth grade, and I was always seeking purpose, like, but like I thought maybe art or like become a carpenter, I don't know. And then all of a sudden, or a cop or like firefighter, like all those typical.
Just the cop?
My God, that's a very diverse.
But no, but I was just like,
maybe I'll become Jesus or a cop. I don't know, like a
well,
carpenter.
Jesus told me that I would become Jesus. So anyway,
Wow.
watch out for the next episode. But is that no? But I was always seeking purpose, and then all of a sudden, through like this pressure of negativity, I was actually found the resolution.
Where was that pressure coming from? Within or without or both?
Both.
Okay.
But I felt like it was outside. And so anyway, it eventually was like music, and that was my saving grace. That I think was a foundation to even me seeking and understanding higher powers, because of that need that felt outside of myself to do something and create.
All right, we're at time.
I think that's a pretty good organic stop there, guys.
Solid.
That was good. Well, we did it.
Killer.
We're in. First one in the bag.
And it felt so natural to just slide into what we do.
Yeah, 100%.